landing from over the pole, flying in a big airliner, chicken flying everywhere around the plane. Could we ever feel much finer coming into Los Angeles?
Last time on Perspective, Margot Drummond and Stephen Bedard introduced you to the rich history of Mound Cemetery. The name comes from the 14 Native American burial mounds that remain part of the cemetery. During the more modern era, Mound Cemetery has served all citizens of Racine since 1852 and is the final resting place for many of Racine's most notable civic leaders, industrialists, and politicians. On this episode of Perspective, we are going to continue our journey through Mound Cemetery, focus on the Civil War, and meet some other celebrities from Racine, who will most likely tell you things about the Bell City you did not know.
Imagine there's no heaven.
During 2004, the Cemetery Commission and others interested in Mound Cemetery created historical reenactments which took place at the cemetery. The scenes centered around the Civil War and were performed by local actors and historians.
In the Racine directories of the 1880s, I was listed as George Suplet, gardener, living on the Rapids Road.
Good afternoon. I'm the first of 3 generations of doctors, all named John Goldsboro Meacham.
My name is Eugene Walter Leach. Some people have called me Racine's first historian, which is quite an honor.
My name is William Upham. Excuse me for eating in front of you, but I never pass up a chance to indulge.
They say I'm an expert at checkers, and I'm Peter Thomas, and I'm a member of Governor Harvey's Post-17 Grand Army of the Republic.
Behind me is one of 2 Civil War plots that are in Mound Cemetery. This plot was designed by a runaway slave named Peter Thomas. Peter Thomas was being forced to work on a project in Tennessee when he escaped, and he was quote-unquote adopted by a man who was in the Wisconsin militia from Beloit. Peter Thomas became this man's assistant and was taken to Beloit, where he actually was able to attend college. Peter Thomas wanted to go back to the South and teach in the segregated schools there, but he was discouraged from doing that, being told that he would probably never be hired. So he decided to stay in Racine, and part of his work was to help develop the Civil War plot. He also was our first coroner. Now, one of the other people who's buried in that plot is Hattie Seward Harrington. Hattie Harrington was a Civil War nurse. She was part Native American, Cherokee Indian.
My mother, White Cloud, was the daughter of a Cherokee Indian chief. My father was a direct descendant of Scottish royalty. And I, Hattie Stewart Harrington, am a product of that union. During the Civil War, I was a nurse in the 24th Illinois Infantry, having received my appointment from Ulysses S. Grant, who I got to know while living in Galena, Illinois. Before leaving Galena, I gathered up food and brandy and bandages for the soldiers. But after one terrible battle, there were no bandages left. So I tore off my clean new petticoat and tore it into strips to use for some. Some of my fellow nurses called me an impudent hussy. I replied, who cares about a woman's legs when men's lives are at stake?
And she lived to be well into her 90s. She lived out on the Mill Mine Road and made her living as a seamstress when the war was over. She refused to take any help from the government, even though she was entitled to it for having served in the Civil War.
As we highlight great patriots from the era of the Civil War, there are two other men that need to be mentioned. A.P. Dutton arrived in Racine in 1841 and became a very successful local grain merchant. Arriving in Racine in 1844 was William L. Utley, a remarkable man of many talents. He at first supported his family by being the proprietor of the Racine House Hotel and the Ives Groves Tavern. Utley was a portrait painter, violinist, and dance instructor. He later became Racine's first marshal.
This violin, I was a colonel in the Civil War, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. And it was while I was in Kentucky that I gained notoriety as an individual who would not return runaway slaves to their masters. One of them was a dwarf. He came to us on a snowy evening. He'd been living in the woods by himself for a week, subsisting on acorns and walnuts because none of the other regiments would take him. I took him. And about 10 days later, Judge Roberson, his master, came and demanded his return, and I refused. Not even General Colburn could force me to return that fellow to his master, nor the two other fugitive slaves that I took in. Ours was the last regiment to leave Louisville, and we were attacked by an angry mob, offended by the fact that we were going to leave town with these fugitive slaves. They came after us with stones and revolvers, but they were no match for our bayonets and rifles.
After his military service was over, Utley and his son began publishing the Racine Journal. Later he became Racine's postmaster and made an unsuccessful run to become Wisconsin's governor.
If you lived in Wisconsin in the 1840s and 50s, the one word on everyone's lips was abolition. Abolish the practice of slavery. Most people that came to Wisconsin came from western New York or points east and brought with them a commitment to removing the scourge of slavery from the land. And for over 20 years, I did my part in that battle.
There are indeed but few events upon record in the history of the United States between the Revolution and the Rebellion that stirred the public mind more deeply, brought into question a more important principle, or raised the populace to a more dangerous frenzy than the never-to-be-forgotten Glover Rescue and the war upon S.M. Booth, the main instigator of said rescue.
A very important part of Racine's early history was the fact that it was an abolitionist community, a very strong abolitionist community. In fact, at one point, a runaway slave named Joshua Glover, who was living in the area, was kidnapped and taken to Milwaukee to be sent back to his owner in the South. And a group of about 100 Racine citizens got together, and they went up to Milwaukee and broke him out of jail and managed to get him to Canada.
Co-authors Ruby West Jackson, formerly of Racine, and Walter T. McDonald, presently of Racine, have just released their new book called Finding Freedom, The Untold Story of Joshua Glover. On June 15, 2007, the authors were joined at Martha Merrill's bookstore by public radio celebrity Greg Berg to read from their book and retell the most dramatic sagas of Joshua Glover's life.
I feel like I'm at Garfield School and I'm about to read to my students.
We're quieter.
Yes, you are.
We're paying attention.
Chapter 1, A Slave in St. Louis. It was New Year's Day, 1850. Joshua stood among the other men, women, and children who were to be offered for sale from the steps of the St. Louis courthouse at this auction of human property. The cold wind blowing off the Mississippi River nearby chilled their ill-clad bodies. They waited their turn to be poked, prodded, and examined by the auctioneer and prospective buyers. A large number of St. Louis slave owners and onlookers surrounded the east side of the brick building where the annual New Year's auction would shortly take place. There was somewhat of a festive air about it, coming to show how important they were, how dressed up they were, and how they were going to prosper the next year. This ritual took place throughout the South at the same time on New Year's Day, and also the border states as well as the South. For those about to be sold, it was the most dreadful days, filled with deep sorrow and fear to the point of terror, as they contemplated the separation from their families that was imminent for some. Husbands and wives pulled from each other's embrace and begging and pleading not to be split up. Infants snatched from their mother's breast as the milk still lingered on their lips, milk that would soon be used to nurse and nourish his new master. When Joshua was stripped, the crowd could see that there were no marks on his back. When told to describe his skills, he would have been honest to say how much strength he had and stamina and the long hours of work that he could do.
Joshua was purchased by Benjamin Stone Garland of St. Louis.
He arranged for Joshua to be sent to the farm. When Joshua arrived there, he found a 300-acre farm under cultivation, run by Garland's half-dozen slaves. Glover himself was the elder male. He worked there for 2 years, give or take, and one day when Garland was out of town for a weekend, Joshua decided, and I shouldn't be calling him Glover at this point, I should be calling him only Joshua, because he had no other name and was prohibited from having a second name. To have given him a second name would have raised him above the status of the family dog and the horses. But on this day, he decided that he no longer wished to be a slave of Garland or of anybody else, and he left. And he headed for parts north. When Garland got back in town and found that his purchase was absent without leave, he had a notice put in the St. Louis Republican, the daily paper. $200 reward, read the headline in it. Ran away from the subscriber, living 4 miles west of the city of St. Louis on Saturday night last, a Negro man by the name of Joshua, about 38 or 40 years of age, about 6 feet high, spare, with long legs and short body, full suit of hair, eyes inflamed and red. His color is an ashy black. But he did eventually end up in Racine sometime in the late spring, early summer probably of 1854, and worked for 2 years at a sawmill that is at the site right now of what used to be the Days Inn Motel up on Rapids Drive. He was playing cards in the cabin, and there came a sharp rap on the door, and his friend opened up, and Glover had something else on his cabin that he'd never had in his life before. He had a lock on the inside. Very simple little thing that none of us takes much thought about. The friend leaped up, and Glover cried out, "Don't open the door till we know who's there." And he did this because there had been rumors in town for a week or more of slave catchers being around, so that he had special reason to be fearful. His so-called friend, ignoring that, yanked open the door, and in came the capture party.
A slave owner named Garland obtained a guide at Racine who directed him to the place where Glover was staying, and he was arrested as a runaway slave from St. Louis. In making the arrest, Glover was frightfully abused and mistreated, although it was declared by eyewitnesses that he made no resistance whatever. He was thrown into a wagon, half conscious and bleeding, and was brought at once to Milwaukee, March 11, 1854. At 9 o'clock a.m., Mr. Booth received a telegram from the mayor of Racine that a Negro named Joshua Glover had been kidnapped near that city by Deputy Marshal Cotton the night previous, and asking him if a warrant had been issued for that purpose. On inquiry, Marshal Cotton denied all knowledge of the transaction, but Judge Miller, a pro-slavery United States judge of the first water, said there had been a warrant issued, and no doubt he would be brought before him for examination. The judge expatiated on the liability of the marshal should the slave escape, and hoped there would be no excitement. Mr. Booth saw the judge and said, "We want a fair and open trial for the fugitive slave, and that he be permitted to have counsel." Mr. Booth soon learned that Glover had arrived in Milwaukee and was in the county jail, all bruised and bloody, and bore marks of the most inhuman and brutal treatment. He at once obtained a saddle horse and rode up and down the street, crying at the top of his voice, "Ho, to the rescue! Ho, to the rescue!" Of course, the people became excited and inquired what was the trouble, that so much noise should be made on the streets, and on explanation of the cause became more excited and immediately repaired to the jail to see for themselves what was going on and to prevent, if possible, the spiriting away of a colored man, Glover, without a legal hearing. In the meantime, Mr. Booth had returned to the jail with some 500 citizens. By 5 o'clock p.m., 100 delegates from Racine arrived, headed by the sheriff of the county with a warrant for the arrest of Garland and United States Marshal Cotton for assault and battery on Glover. They landed at the steamboat wharf and marched to the county jail. The bells were ringing, and the people assembled in large numbers. Mr. Booth explained to the Racine delegation what had been done and denounced the Fugitive Slave Act. But he cautioned the people against violence. Mr. Booth made his announcement publicly when the crowd made a rush for the jail. On arriving there, a demand was made for the keys of the jail of the undersheriff of the jail, S.S. Conover, but the request was denied, whereupon about 20 strong and resolute men seized a large timber some 8 or 10 inches square and 20 feet long and went for the jail door. Bum, bum, and down came the jail door, and out came Glover. About this time, the United States Marshal made his appearance upon the scene, and a rescue was attempted from those who had Glover in their possession, and for about 20 minutes or half an hour, the devil was to pay. Glover was well kept in hand by his rescuers from the jail to Wisconsin Street, about 1,000 people following in the wake. Sometimes it seemed as though the marshal and sheriff's posse would rescue him from the angry populace, but on they went from Wisconsin Street to East Water Street and down East Water Street to what was then called Walker's Point Bridge, while the crowd was constantly increasing. But the victory was for the rescuers. On arriving at the bridge, John A. Messenger, a Democrat, came along and wanted to know what was up. What was this large crowd in search of, was his inquiry. After being told, he said, "Put that man into my buggy," and no quicker said than done, and away he went with the whole posse of the United States government in his wake. But he had a fleet and strong horse. He took a westerly course out of the city towards Waukesha, but he meandered on several roads here and there, so that the slave hunters on his track gave up the chase and exclaimed, "Lost, lost, lost."
Joshua Glover is not buried at Mound Cemetery. However, at this point, his life intersects with one of Racine's pioneer community leaders and early renowned activist.
One of the most active abolitionists was a man named A.P. Dutton. A.P. Dutton had built some warehouses down on the Lakeshore River area, and there he stored grain. That really got business going in Racine. The farmers could bring their grain in. It could be shipped out on ships that were oftentimes from this area. It created a lot of commerce, and later on, of course, it helped with the development of the J.I. Case Company in this area. But the story goes that A.P. Dutton shipped more than grain out of his warehouses. He also helped runaway slaves get to Canada.
Well, let's suppose that a grain merchant, in his work, would get to know every single captain of every single steamboat that was heading north to Canada. And let's suppose the grain merchant would find out about their political and philosophical leanings and would learn about the safe houses and places where fugitive slaves could hide. And let's suppose a grain merchant could work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping the fugitives in that last leg of that long journey to freedom.
Now, it's very possible that some of those runaway slaves were hidden at the First Presbyterian Church downtown. In the basement of the First Presbyterian Church, they have found remnants of what were probably things left by these runaway slaves as they were hidden in the so-called furnace room area. Then at night, they could be taken down to the wharf where A.P. Dutton knew which Great Lakes sea captains were willing to take the slaves to their freedom in Canada.
After escaping, Joshua was hidden at 7 or 8 different places, which included at least 2 trips back to Racine.
He finally ended up back he was in Racine at least twice, maybe 3 times in all that. And he ended up back in Racine at the warehouse of A.P. Dutton, a grain merchant, a few blocks down that way, a little bit over there. And Dutton arranged for passage to Canada.
This cemetery has so many different types of topics that could be talked about. The Civil War is certainly one of them. Another one is that there are various ethnic groups who occupy certain parts of this cemetery. Usually a church would buy a group of plots, and then members of the church would buy the individual spaces for the graves. Another thing that could be talked about are the industrialists who are buried here, also the Native Americans and the Native American Indian mounds, and I think also just the stories of all the people who have brought their loved ones here, who have grieved here. And one reason I think it's so important that the city maintain these cemeteries is because we all have a stake in this one way or another. We may all have loved ones here. And the Cemetery Commission in particular feels that it's responsibility to serve the public and make sure that those loved ones are tended in death the way we would like to still be tending them in life.
You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm